Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As we all know, in June this year, new transparency rules came in for clinical trials done in the EU. These have huge implications on patents, so it's crucial that we know how to optimize patent strategies going forward to maximize our chances of success. In today's webinar, we'll explore this. My name is Karen Ng, and I'm a patent attorney in Kemp's Biotechnology and Life Sciences Group. Here at Kemp, we're finding that the new transparency rules are impacting many of our clients, so I hope this webinar will be helpful for you as well. And with me today is James Biddlecombe, Head of Business Transformation at DLRC, an award-winning regulatory consultancy.
Thanks, Karen, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. A little bit of background to myself. I've worked with the CTR for the last 7 years. I initially worked at the European Medicines Agency in the CTIS business team, and I spent the last 5 years in consulting, supporting clients with both readiness for the CTR and subsequent applications for the submission under this new regulatory framework.
These are the topics that we're covering today. James will kick us off by going through the key points of the EU clinical trial transparency rules. I will then explain how these are relevant to patents and give insight into patent filing strategies. To make these concrete, we'll give an example to illustrate how clinical trial disclosures would impact on patent filing strategies. This example will highlight why it's important that the legal and regulatory teams talk with each other, not only early on, but also throughout the life cycle of clinical trials. To set the scene, let me give you some examples of what aspects of drug development may be patentable. For example, patentable inventions may be the drug or combinations of drugs under investigation in a clinical trial. This may be its structure, its formulation, or method of making the drug. Other patentable inventions may come from the clinical trial design or endpoints of a clinical trial. And these may be the dosage, the administration schedule, the administration route, or the particular group of patients being investigated. The publication of all this information is dictated by the EU clinical trial transparency rules. And James will now explain this in more detail.
Thanks so much, Karen. So what I'd like to do is, as Karen said, start to apply this patentable aspect and set it in the context of the EU clinical trials transparency rules. I'm going to start by just having this as a setting the scene slide, and we'll build on this. So in the top swim lane in green, we can see just a very typical life cycle of a clinical trial. We've got our 4 key stages. So we've got stage 1 is our clinical trial application submitted into CTIS, the Clinical Trial Information System. This is the new system brought about by the CTR for the submission of applications in the EU. Our stage 2 is going to be our clinical trial application assessment conducted by the member states, where they may ask questions as part of the process. Our 3rd stage being the conduct of our clinical trial, and then finally closing out with data analysis and submission of final results, hopefully eventually going into further registration marketing authorization application. Underneath in the sort of the beige type swim lane, we've got the documents that are related to the life cycle. So typically clinical trial application, we've just listed core documents here. We're looking at protocol, informed consent form, investigator's brochure, scientific advice summary, for example. But we may have interim results, and we'll have that final report at the end of the data analysis phase as well. And as Karen mentioned before, we have patentable aspects that are going to appear within these documents that are submitted as part of a clinical trial application. But why does that matter? Why are we having the webinar today? Well, really, it comes back to one of the key benefits of the regulation stipulated by the EMA and the European Commission, which is to increase the transparency of information on clinical trials. And this relates directly to the EU clinical trial rules that we see today. But before I go into the new rules, I want to give just a bit of a history lesson on what the old rules looked like, because I think that really helps to contextualize what the new rules are and how things are moving forwards. So under the old CTR transparency rules. The documents that are listed here as part of your clinical trial application, or were made public, they are put into the CTIS public domain, where anyone with internet access can access the clinical trial, can access the documents, download them, and read everything as part of the document. Now, we've just mentioned that there may be patentable aspects that reside within these documents. So how as an organization do I protect my information if it's ending up in a CTIS public website? Well, under the old rules, there were two key methods to do this. Number one was you can redact the information. You can put it into a PDF and you can just put the black box around it so that you can't see what's underneath. But additionally, under the old rules, you could defer the availability of this information into the public domain. And so if we take, for example, a phase 2 clinical trial, we could defer the availability of the protocol and investigators brochure to appear in the CTIS public website for up to 5 years after the end of the clinical trial in the EU. And so the idea really behind this was that so much time has passed since you submitted the documents that the information was no longer considered as intellectual property, was no longer considered as commercially confidential information, and its release wouldn't jeopardize economic interests of the sponsor. So these were the two methods, and in my experience, this brought about a lot of confusion and discussion around, well, if I redact, can I also defer? And if I defer, does the release of the information in a later time point, how do I predict whether that will still be commercially confidential or not after the deferral? So can I sort of double protect by doing a deferral and a redaction? And what would member states think of this? Would they accept it? And so I think there was a lot of discussion and a lot of potentially confusion around how to approach things. I will say, fortunately, as part of the new rules, these were released in October 2023. You could apply them from December last year, but CTIS, really, it was implemented in CTIS earlier this year in June, which completely removed the option to defer the publication of data. The default trigger for the release of documents in the CTIS public website is the date of decision on the clinical trial application assessment. So this is before you've started the study, before you've enrolled your first patient. The protocol will be in the public domain via the CTIS public website. So our only option now, we don't have an option to defer. Our only option now is to redact the information that we may consider as commercially confidential or patentable. The last thing I'll mention here is that we can also see in the document swim lane, the number of types of documents, let's say, has been reduced. So we're not looking at investigators brochure anymore. We're not considering labels, scientific advice summary. We're restricting that down to protocol and its synopsis, informed consent form, and recruitment arrangements. But the patentable information may still reside within these documents. And later in the webinar, we're going to take you through an example scenario to demonstrate this, but also to show you, well, what do you do and how do you approach this, both from a patent perspective, but also a CTR transparency perspective. But before that, I'll hand back to Karen for some discussion on patent filing considerations.
Thanks, James. So now we have earlier disclosure of clinical trial information. Why does it matter, and how is this relevant to patents? Well, when this information is published, it becomes part of the art. A patent is assessed relative to what is in the art. The relevance of the art would depend on the nature of the invention, and this in turn guides us as to what we can claim in a patent. As you may remember from the first slide, inventions can arise from many aspects of a clinical trial. When they relate to the trial design or endpoints, for example, they can be claimed in a patent in what we generally refer to as medical use claims. A requirement for patent is that the claimed invention has to be new. So for medical use claim, being new means that it's not previously known that the drug can treat the disease. Another requirement for patent is that the claimed invention has to be inventive. For medical use claim, this means that the treatment would not have been obvious from the art, or that the treatment has unexpected advantages over the prior art. A further requirement for a patent is that the claimed invention has to be sufficiently disclosed in the patent. For medical use claim, this would mean that the information in the patent has to show that the treatment works. Data in a patent is helpful. Data can be relied on to establish an inventive step, and this is particularly important if inventiveness is based on a surprising result observed in patients. Data may also be necessary for meeting sufficiency requirements, for example, to show that the treatment in the medical use claim actually works. This is particularly relevant in Europe, and we've seen medical use patents in Europe that are invalidated because they don't have enough in the patent to show credibly that the treatment works. As you can imagine, the longer we wait for data to include in a patent, the more prior art there'll probably be out there. So when deciding on an optimal time point for filing a patent, we need to take all these considerations and factors into account so we can maximize the chance that the patentability criteria can be met. And each invention needs to be considered separately. There's no one-size-fits-all patent filing strategy. For inventions that arise from clinical trials done in the EU, as we explained already, that the prior art will be dictated by the EU clinical trial transparency rules. So this is why we need to understand what clinical trial information will be published, when this will be published, and whether this information can be protected under the clinical trial regulation. Having a good knowledge in this area is important for optimizing patent filing strategies. So when is a good time to think about patent filing strategies? Well, obviously, the earlier the better. Let's put this into context for inventions from clinical trials. So here's a clinical trial timeline that was shown in James' slides earlier. We've highlighted here an early time point that the trial information will be made public in CTIS. We would want to think about patent filing strategies at the planning stage, such as when the clinical trial team is putting together the application for permission to do the clinical trial. An example filing strategy may be to file early, so before any clinical trial information is disclosed. Or at the other extreme, we could file late and wait for clinical trial data to become available so we can include them in the patent. In the early filing strategy, the clinical trial information will not be prior art, although there may be other relevant prior art. Filing early means that the clinical trial data won't be available for including in the patent. So this early filing strategy tends to be more suited for inventions where clinical trial data is not expected to be important for establishing an inventive step or for meeting sufficiency requirements. In late filing strategy, clinical trial data is included in the patent. So this may be more suited for inventions that rely on data to establish inventive step. For inventions that you really need clinical trial data to show that it would work, they're also more suited for this late filing strategy from a European perspective. But bear in mind that with this strategy, there will be more prior art. So these include publications from the clinical trial itself or from parallel clinical trials going on outside the EU. There may also be press releases and publications from competitors. And also, the clinical trial itself may become relevant prior art if it wasn't done in a confidential manner. So once we've decided on a patent filing strategy, this doesn't mean that the job's done and let's see how the strategy pans out. We will want to regularly check in with all the teams involved throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial. By this, I mean the clinical trial team, the regulatory team, and the legal team. Essentially, whenever information is about to be published, or when data becomes available, such as the interim data or the final data, that is when we would want to check in with everyone. So for example, before information becomes public in CTIS, it would be good to check that whatever strategy we've decided at the planning stage follows through. So if it was decided to file early, make sure that a patent is then filed before any publications. Or if the strategy involves redaction, check that the information is actually redacted before uploading them onto CTIS. When data becomes available, this is also a good time to check in with everyone. So if it's decided to go with a late filing strategy, then this is the time you have to think about filing the patent. Even if you've gone with an early filing strategy, this is also a good point to check in because the data may provide yet a further opportunity to file a patent. So for example, the data may show unexpected effects that can form basis for inventive step. And examples of unexpected effects might include the particular efficacy in certain patient groups or improvements of particular symptoms. So I just had a quick question as to what type of claims would you file for the late patent filing strategy? So for example, if there's unexpected efficacy in patient group, then we can have a medical use claim that's directed to using a drug to treat a disease in this particular patient group. So that's the kind of claims that we can draft around based on the unexpected effects we can observe from the data. So if you end up having an early file patent as well as a later one, so given how long clinical trials tend to take, the early filed patent may well be prior art against the later one, and this may be problematic. So if you do go down this strategy of filing early and late, make sure your legal team is aware of the full picture and make sure you get their advice on their strategy. So let's have a quick recap before we move on to the example scenario. I've explained how early disclosure of clinical trial information is relevant to patents. We've gone through some example filing strategies. And last but not least, to optimize patent filing opportunities, all the teams involved need to check in with each other throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial. We will now go through an example scenario which aims to put everything that we've talked about into context. So here's the situation. We've just completed a phase 2 trial with 1.25 milligrams. We think that a lower dose may be better. And so now we're planning a phase 3 trial with a 1.25 dose and a new arm that will test this new dose of 0.5 milligrams. So the new dosage of 0.5 milligrams that will be investigated in the phase 3 trial is patentable subject matter. In Europe, an example claim may be the drug for use in a method of treating a disease, wherein the method comprises administering the drug at a daily dose of 0.5 mg. So what information on the phase 3 trial will be published and when? If we go with an early filing strategy, the phase 3 trial will not be prior art because we're going to file before any information on this phase 3 trial is published. But if we go with the late filing strategy, then yes, the phase 3 trial protocol, it will be prior art because it will be published in CTIS, as James has explained earlier. And we know that relevant information may be redacted. So having taken all the factors into account, it's decided that data is important. So for example, it may be that pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics data from humans is really important for establishing an inventive step here. And the decision then was made to file late, so we can include that data from the clinical trial in the patent. And it would be good if the dosage information is not prior art against this patent. And James will now take us through how to keep the dosage information from the public domain by redaction.
Thanks, Karen. And clearly the highlight here, well, from my perspective, working from a regulatory and a clinical trial regulation side, is the most important. Will be prior art unless redacted. And so, of course, we are now looking at how do we appropriately redact and potentially mask the information that will appear as part of the application. So I appreciate this is quite small and you may have to zoom in very slightly. There are actually two key areas that I think we need to consider here when it comes to locations that may contain the dosage information at the 0.5 milligrams that we're determining as patentable information. And so these are a couple of screenshots taken from CTIS. They are taken from dummy studies, so I am using paracetamol tablets 500 milligrams for the sake of showing you an example. It is not a 0.5 milligrams, but hopefully you can exclude that from your viewing of the example. So we're looking at part one of our clinical trial application. We're looking specifically at product section, and we're looking in our dosage and administration details. You can see key information that's provided here that would pertain to a 0.5 milligram dose, your maximum daily dose allowed potentially. But also you'll see that there are other areas and other information that Karen mentioned in the table right at the beginning, route of administration, for example. And so the key question is, how do we provide this information without providing this information? Because you'll see from the red boxes, and you'll see in the other 4 fields as well, there's an asterisk by each of these fields. Now, this means that it is a mandatory field per CTIS. You cannot submit your application without providing at least something in each of these fields. If you went to submit, you'll get a red box in the top right-hand corner of CTIS that says, you haven't populated all the mandatory fields, please go back and fill them in. So the question remains, we don't want to provide 0.5 milligrams in this section, but we have to provide something to satisfy CTIS system validation rules. How do we do it? Well, in following EMA guidance, we can and we are permitted to provide dummy data as part of these fields. So we can provide 0, 0, and that is the example specifically used in EMA guidance as part of this daily dose field, for example. So we can simultaneously keep the 0.5 milligram out of the CTIS public domain, but it still fulfills the CTIS field requirements for a mandatory field. That's specifically with structured data. And I think sometimes that's forgotten as an area by which you're still providing information that may be considered as commercially confidential information and the basis for a patent filing application. So that's the first area, that's CTIS application, structured data. For this example, part 1 products, dosage and administration details. The second area is within our clinical trial application protocol. You'll notice that there are 2 documents here. There are 2 PDFs, and these are 2 instances, let's say, of our protocol version 1. And so what we need to do is provide 2 instances of our protocol document. One which will be redacted. It will redact the 0.5 milligram data that is within the protocol, within the study arm details, for example, and that is uploaded and allocated for publication. So this is the document type that is pushed into the CTIS public domain. You will also need to provide, this is the bottom document here, the protocol that is unredacted, a clean version, that is allocated as not for publication, because the member states will need this information for the basis of their assessment. So for any document that you are providing where you have redactions, you need to provide the for publication version, which is redacted, which is the one that CTIS takes and puts in the public domain, and you have the equivalent document, clean, not for publication, no redactions, and that's the one that member states use for the basis of their assessment. Something I want to really highlight here in the red box is you'll see that this says specifically, it says English, but then it says protocol for publication, and the bottom one says protocol not for publication. This is the system allocation for this document. You'll also notice just above each of these red boxes is what I've called the document. I've named it D1 protocol with the EUCT number _redacted and without it. This is CTCG naming conventions. This bears 0 relation to whether this document is made public or not. I could have equivalently put an _redacted in a not for publication or the other way around, the CTIS does not take the name that you add to it. It takes the system allocation, which is in the red box underneath. So it's absolutely crucial that this is looked at and this is checked. The reason I mention it so much is that I've seen historically mistakes happen. I've seen documents within the CTIS public website that contain people's signatures. It contains other personal data that's not in the exception rules from a GDPR perspective, where it's been very clear that this document has been incorrectly allocated from a system perspective for publication and not for publication allocation. So that's my real sort of one of the key takeaway messages I'd like you to take away today is making sure that you're not accidentally putting an unredacted document in the allocation for publication. So in theory, then, we've done this and we've sufficiently protected the 0.5 milligram dose from pushing this into the public domain, into the CTIS public website. It's currently not considered prior art because we're protecting this information. We're going to expand the scenario slightly. We're going to look at modifying our study and specifically looking at, in this example, we need to change our inclusion or our exclusion criteria. It's likely to have a significant impact on rights and safety of trial participants. It's therefore classified as a substantial modification. We're going to be submitting this for assessment by the member states. Just a side note, this will also apply for non-substantial modifications as well. It's just in this example, we've used a substantial modification. It says here in the middle box, we have an inconsistent redaction approach. So what we've done in this scenario, we've taken the Word version of our protocol version 1. We have made the updates and the changes offline to the inclusion and or exclusion criteria. We've changed nothing in relation to the 0.5 milligrams and the study arm for 0.5 milligrams. We've re-PDF'd the document to protocol version 2, and we've uploaded this for submission into CTIS as a substantial modification to the study, and we've submitted this for member state review. This version does not contain redactions because we've had to edit the original Word version. You haven't edited directly from a PDF version 1.0. So our protocol version 2.0 does not contain any redaction. So what does this mean? Protocol version 2 is made public at the time of decision of the substantial modification. Under the revised rules, you're looking at any amendment, you're looking at a substantial or a non-substantial modification will be additionally pushed to the public domain. It's not just the original or the initial application protocol version 1. And so regardless of whether we've updated any information in relation to the patentable information, in this example, we didn't update anything in relation to our study arm of 0.5 milligrams, that information is now in the public domain via this protocol 2.0 that we didn't redact, or we didn't redact consistently as part of our process. So this information is now prior art. Protocol version 2 is in the public domain, contains the 0.5 milligrams. It's now considered as prior art. So clearly there are learnings as part of this. And I think the first is really make use of the redaction as part of a patent filing strategy. I think just because the data and information are subject to publication under CTR, are subject to publication under what were quite aggressive redaction rules, I think are still reasonably ambitious from a publication perspective. Make use of it. Don't just ignore the fact that you can redact this patentable information and protect it and link it into a patent filing strategy. Ensure that this strategy is robust throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial application. As we saw, it's not just the initial application, it's substantial modification 1, 2, 3, 4, non-substantial modification 1 and 2, etc., etc. And so it's not just the strategy for the initial application. Ensure that it's applied throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial application. And ensure the redaction strategy aligns with the patent strategy. EMA has guidance on what can be considered as commercially confidential information from a CTR perspective, but if there's no internal communication between regulatory, legal, and clinical, i.e. the teams that are doing the patent application process and the teams that are doing the CTR redaction and transparency process, then you'll have a misalignment in terms of what's considered as protected data. And you may not be redacting the 0.5 milligrams because it may not have been considered as commercially confidential from a regulatory or clinical team, but clearly confidential from a legal perspective. So it's ensuring that redaction strategy aligns with the patent strategy as well.
Great, thank you, James. We'll now take a few minutes to answer your questions. So the first one, so this question more for James. The redaction mechanism seems a good way for delaying disclosure of patentable subject matter. Can I just rely on that rather than think about patent filing strategies?
I think yes, with a few caveats. I would say that I think it's important to highlight risk as part of that process. It's very much a company by company decision as well. I think there are two key things that I'd mention. If there's anything that I can think of in addition, then I can circulate it around as an email afterwards. But I think the two key things I'd mention here are, my initial assumption is that if you're deciding to rely on a redaction process, you may have a higher volume of information that you therefore consider as redactable. So you're automatically needing to manage more information as part of that redaction process and that redaction control. In the example scenario, we saw how that robust strategy is required not only for the initial application, but also for the trial lifecycle, substantial modifications, non-substantial modifications, etc. But also consider that you may have the same patentable information across multiple EU clinical trials. So it may not be that you're just needing to control and manage the redactions in clinical trial A. You may have the same patentable information in trial B, C, and D as well. And so I think that it's a valid approach, but I would say that you need to clearly de-risk your redaction process and understand very clearly what's considered as patentable information and what needs to be protected across a portfolio. And the second thing I was going to say is that we focused on CTR transparency as part of the webinar. It's of course not the only mechanism by which potentially patentable information can enter the public domain. And so an example I could think of was a company press release. And so it's not just CTR. CTR is clearly very important and clearly a mechanism by which patentable information can enter the public domain, even when you don't want it to. But there are other methods by which this can be released. And so there's more of a company-wide acceptance and buy-in on how to protect the information sufficiently. So yes, I think it can be a valid approach, but I think you need to sufficiently assess, de-risk the management of redactions and have a solid overall data transparency approach.
Great, thank you, James. So the next question we have is, if we're going to file a patent before any clinical trial information is published, then is there any point in redacting that patentable subject matter from the clinical trial application? Well, there are kind of two aspects to this answer. So the first aspect is that the redaction is certainly an option here in this early patent filing strategy. And then the second aspect is that this is an interesting strategy. So if you file early as well as do the redaction, because it could create a further patent filing opportunity. And I'll explain a bit more. So with the first bit about a patent application is not published for 18 months. So in the meantime, the patentable subject matter will continue to qualify for redaction under the clinical trial regulation. And when patent application publishes at 18 months though, the information in the patent application will then be in the public domain. And this means that subject matter will no longer qualify for redaction under clinical trials regulation. So that means that essentially we will need to release that information from redaction in the documents being submitted in CTIS. And this kind of links to the second point of creating further patent filing strategy. So at that point, before the patent application publishes and before releasing that redacted information, this actually is a very good time to think about patent filing. For example, some data may be available by that point, which may give rise to new inventions, or there may be other patentable subject matter that come to light. So if we were to go with this strategy, so file early and also redact, I think the main thing to bear in mind is to remember the 18-month time point, and then make sure that there's a robust strategy that we can implement to keep the relevant information out of the public domain during that 18-month period, and as well as remembering to kind of check in and consider filing.
Thanks, Karen. I'm just looking at one on, is block redaction of paragraph sections or pages frowned upon by the EMA? So it's sometimes a difficult thing to answer. Generally, the answer is yes, they would frown upon it. But in this instance, because you're running a clinical trial application, it's assessed by member states and not by the European Medicines Agency. So you'll have national competent authorities, AEMPS, ANSEM, AIFA, etc., who are assessing the application. If you were to submit a for publication document that had block redactions all over the page, I would imagine they'd come back to you as part of a request for information and say, please do this appropriately per the guidance that was released, considering the information that you can truly consider as redactable. But there's not an official review process that you would see similar to Policy 70 by the EMA. You're having your Module 5 as part of a marketing authorization application or your CSR, that you have to have your patient anonymization strategy. You need to submit a justification for your redaction of commercially confidential information. This is then reviewed by EMA. I think there was a staggering statistic that 95% plus of the proposed redactions of commercially confidential information by sponsors was rejected by EMA in the first few years of Policy 70. But it's very different from a CTR perspective because you don't have to provide that justification as to why you're redacting the information, as there's not that same official review process that the EMA run as part of Policy 70. I also would say that I don't think that then allows you to be completely free with redactions and do huge block redactions of paragraphs and sections. So I think there's a level of trust that is had between the agencies and the sponsors that there is guidance that can be followed. Please do this sensibly, and we'll monitor the situation and see how sponsors are taking it. And if there's additional further action, then they can ask a question as part of an RFI. They may change a process later down the line. In the second example, why is it not possible to redact again the dose information in the modified protocol, the version 2? Is it just part of the scenario, or is it because it's not possible to redact modified protocol at all? We deliberately didn't redact it in the scenario. It's perfectly possible to do this as part of a normal process. What we wanted to do was firstly show you consequences as what happens if you do it incorrectly, but also try and show you that it's quite easy to miss something if you're modifying something that isn't related at all to the patentable information that you're redacting. I think sometimes, unless you have a real laser focus on this, I think that you were modifying inclusion-exclusion criteria here. You weren't touching anything on a dose. So you may not naturally think of redacting the 0.5 milligrams. Of course, in this, it's 2 minutes and the next slide. In reality, it may be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months after you've started your study, and maybe even after you've submitted the initial application that you need to do it. And so, yes, it was very much an example to show you and to highlight the consequences of not doing it correctly. But in real life, it is perfectly possible to redact the version 2. And of course, it's strongly encouraged, if not mandatory, to do that to appropriately protect the data.
I see a few questions that relate to a similar theme on the patent filing strategy, so I'll take that. So these questions relate to early patent filing strategy. So if we were to go with that, what would you include to help meet sufficiency and inventive step criteria? And also, can you then rely on post-file data for inventive step, for example? So if we were to file early, we would suggest that you put as much information as you can on the invention and what you think the technical effect of the invention is. So for example, any available data, any animal data, in vitro data, it would be useful for that to include in the patent. And also any technical explanation of mechanistic link between, for example, the drug and the treatment. So these are information that would be really helpful if you have to justify during an opposition or during prosecution of a patent, whether the information in the patent is enough to make it credible that the treatment works. And in terms of relying on post-file data, in some situations, the patent may be able to rely on data that's available after the filing date of the patent. For example, to establish inventive step or meet sufficiency requirements. So whether post-file data can be relied on or not is actually a really hot topic at the moment in Europe. The European Patent Office Enlarged Board of Appeal, which is the highest court at the European Patent Office, they've recently given some guidance in their decision. It's called G221. And there's lots of interesting insight. So I'll definitely recommend reading that. But in general, I think whether you can rely on post-file data or not, that's assessed on a case-by-case basis. And for medical use patent, the more information there is in the patent on the relevant technical effect, then the more likely the patent may be able to rely on the post-file data. I know it sounds a bit abstract, so I'll give you an example. So if we're claiming a drug combination and you want to rely on post-file data showing synergistic effects of the drugs for inventive step, then if there's already some evidence in the patent showing or explaining the synergistic effect, then that would make it likelier that post-file data would be allowed to be brought in to support your inventive step arguments. So I guess the short answer is you may be able to rely on post-file data, but it really depends on a case-by-case basis.
So there's another way which says, are there any fields which cannot be redacted? I assume this is relating to the actual clinical trial application form, the structured data, or the fields that appear as part of the application. The really tricky part of this is that you can't redact information in a field within CTIS. This was really, really challenging in the old rules when the responses to your request for information were subject to publication. Everything except relating to quality, so CMC, the responses to RFIs were subject to publication. Under the new rules, I think it's very fortunate that these responses are not subject to publication. And also it states within the guidance that any uplift of versions that you need to make as part of a response to an RFI, e.g. going to 1.1 protocol as part of a question response, are also not subject to publication, but just remember the substantial modifications are. Of course, from a field perspective, you can't apply the redaction box that you can as part of PDF functionality. And so I think that's where the dummy data of just adding a 00, which to a public user means nothing, is put in place, because you couldn't put 0.5 and then say, well, could you put a black box around this so no one in the public domain could see it? I think generally as well, and this is much easier said than done, I fully appreciate this, is that in some instances, you may be able to change the wording of the information that would appear within the field to support with quote unquote redacting it. So it's not an official redaction per an Adobe PDF, but you're not necessarily including it within a field that would be made public. Dummy data is the example of one, but rewording may allow you to provide things differently. I would say that is possibly more related to the old rules, where you could potentially, as part of an RFI response, you could say, this is the summary of the response and the additional detail is found within a document that's not subject to publication. So again, I think it's just There's absolutely a not one size fits all when it comes to sort of theorizing and strategizing on redactions as part of an application form. And I admit it's difficult because there's lots of different areas in which this information could reside and present itself. But yes, for the fields within CTIS, within the application form, whatever you write in the field would be subject to publication. You can't specify, if I put something in quotes, can you redact it? That isn't possible from that side of things. Final question. This was a redaction of protocols and different version of protocols. What about investigator brochures? Can we redact them? What do we do with further versions? If this conversation were this time last year, I would say you have to apply, under the old rules, you have to apply the same approach you do for protocols as you do IBs. Under the revised transparency rules applicable now, the investigator brochure is not in scope for publication. And so you don't have the for publication, not for publication that you do with the protocol for an IB anymore. You did under the previous rules, but you don't under the new rules. So it's limited to the protocol and its synopsis, the informed consent form, and recruitment arrangements. There was a question on what that contains. There is a template in UDLX Volume 10 on recruitment arrangements. It's just how you are potentially obtaining consent from patients, but it's also advertisement materials that you might be using as part of the study. So that encompasses sort of recruitment arrangements as part of the requirements for a clinical trial application. But yes, the investigator brochure is no longer a document that is made public under the CTR revised transparency rules.
Great, thanks, James. So I'll just wrap up to summarize what we've learned today. So we learned that under the revised EU clinical trial transparency rules, there's early disclosure of clinical trial information, although we can redact patentable subject matter. This is one of the factors we need to think about when we're considering patent filing strategies. We have to take a nuanced approach, and there's no one-size-fits-all patent strategy. And it's important to make sure that we engage with all the teams involved, especially the legal, the regulatory teams, the clinical trial teams. And this engagement has to take place very early on and also throughout the life cycle of a clinical trial.
So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. For further insights on optimizing patent strategies under the revised EU clinical trials transparency rules, we invite you to check out our collaborative white paper, which is available in the resource section.
And also keep an eye out on LinkedIn for details of future JA Kemp webinars. And in the meantime, please do take a look at our extensive library of past webinars.
And additionally, if you're keen to stay informed about the rapidly evolving landscape of clinical trials, we encourage you to sign up for the Insight, which is DLRC's bi-monthly newsletter. And this is an excellent resource for staying up to date with the latest regulatory developments and how they may affect your products.
And finally, if you'd like to discuss any of the topics covered in more detail or have any further questions, please just contact us directly at JAChem or DLRC. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.